moved to this neighborhood to enjoy the peace and quiet of my small farm. But for my neighbor Linda, it was a nuisance. She believed that this place should be orderly, noise-free, and definitely not a place for a farm. From the letters of complaint to the HOA to the prying eyes every morning, Linda was constantly trying to get me to give in. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't one to back down, and if she wanted to fight, I was willing to fight to the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next exciting content. I never expected a small farm to turn me into a security threat in a quiet residential area on the outskirts of Austin. I just wanted to enjoy the simple life, away from traffic and exhaust fumes. When I had the opportunity to buy this spacious plot of land, large enough to raise a few favorite animals, I thought I had found paradise. I raised a flock of chickens for eggs, a few goats for milk, and 2 gentle dairy cows, Buttercup and Daisy, who enjoyed munching on grass and watching sunsets like a leisurely housewife by the pool. I didn't raise them for business. I simply enjoyed taking care of them, waking up to the roosters crowing and sipping coffee as the sun rose. Everything was peaceful until Linda showed up. Linda is no ordinary neighbor. She's HOA Linda, who controls the neighborhood without a council seat. While most residents simply follow HOA rules to avoid trouble, Linda sees it as a mission. She not only follows the rules, but also acts as a self-appointed enforcer of justice, protecting the integrity of the neighborhood. Grass 3 inches high, report it. Car parked slightly off-center, send a warning letter. Flower pots placed in the wrong place, she'll call an HOA meeting. Before I met her, I'd heard of her, but naively believed I was innocent. My biggest mistake was underestimating Linda. From day one, a mysterious white SUV would drive slowly by my house as if collecting data. Every morning while I fed the chickens, I could feel Linda's sharp gaze through the glass, like a hawk stalking its prey. At first I tried to ignore it, believing that if there were no serious violations, Linda would soon lose interest. But then, early one morning, as I was scattering chicken seed for the chickens, she appeared by the fence, notebook in hand, her face as stony as an FBI agent. She stood watching me for a long time, took a note, and then quietly walked away. Was she calculating Buttercup and Daisy's vocalization? Sure enough, I soon received the first letter from the HOA, a friendly reminder about the noise ordinance clearly aimed at me. A week later, a second letter arrived, referring to the aesthetics of the area, a thinly veiled dig at my animals. By the third letter, with its direct warning about animal nuisance, I knew Linda had declared war. And me? I didn't like trouble, but if anyone wanted to cause trouble, I was ready to fight back. I had thought my farm noise wasn't loud enough to spark a neighborhood war, but I had misjudged Linda. If anyone could turn a small issue into a neighborhood disaster, it was her. The HOA letters were just the beginning, and when Linda saw that I wouldn't budge, she upped the ante. It started with a formal complaint to the HOA about unacceptable noise levels on my property. When I opened the notice, I almost laughed at the flowery language. In order to maintain harmony and quality of life, please control sounds that may disturb other residents. I imagine teaching roosters to meditate to stop crowing, or giving out noise-canceling headphones to goats. The idea was unrealistic, but Linda didn't care about logic. If she wanted to make my farm an issue, she was willing to go to any lengths. When a letter wasn't enough to dissuade me, Linda stepped up her attacks. In less than a month, I received 3 separate complaints about excessive animal noise. Each time, she targeted a specific target. First, the morning crowing of a rooster, then the jingling of goat bells, and finally the accusation that Buttercup and Daisy's mooing was negatively affecting the sleep and mental health of residents within a 3-house radius. I wondered how she measured the psychological impact of a mooing cow. Perhaps she had conducted an internal survey, or simply made up the numbers herself from her living room. What was even stranger was that no one else in the neighborhood had ever complained. The kids still came over, and a few neighbors thanked me for free fresh eggs. But Linda didn't need the majority's approval. She just needed the HOA laws on her side. So she started gathering evidence. I don't know how she did it, but I suspect Linda had a secret audio archive of recordings of roosters crowing every morning, videos zooming in on goats prancing around with dramatic captions as if they were a gang of gangsters disrupting the peace of the neighborhood. And when that wasn't enough, Linda turned to another tactic: community mobilization. Somehow, Linda managed to email the HOA board, attaching a powerful document about the health effects of noise. She didn't stop there, printing flyers and handing them out to homes with the sensational headline, "Protect Our Neighborhood from Noise Pollution." Below is a list of sources of negative influence, from delivery trucks, barking dogs, lawn mowers running early, and especially farm animals in residential areas. It doesn't take a genius to figure out who the flyer is really targeting. I began to notice that some of my neighbors were looking at me differently. Not everyone believed Linda, but when someone keeps bringing up an issue, no matter how absurd, there are always people who waver. A few people began to ask vaguely if I was planning to reduce the number of pets. I didn't blame them, as Linda had clearly done a great job of sowing anxiety in the community. But what made me laugh the most was when I heard a rumor from a neighbor that my chickens might be trained to crow at strategic times to disturb Linda's sleep. I didn't know whether to be proud or alarmed at the creativity of this imagination. Linda wasn't just complaining, she was waging an organized campaign, a personal crusade against me and my little farm. But what Linda didn't know was that I wasn't the type to back down. If she wanted to fight, I was willing to go all the way. I knew Linda wouldn't stop, but I didn't expect her to go this far. The constant complaints, the anti-noise pollution flyers, and the neighbor calling campaign had finally had an effect. The HOA, which just wanted to keep the neighborhood peaceful, decided to intervene. On Monday morning, I opened my mailbox and found a formal envelope bearing the HOA logo. It was no longer the gentle reminders of the past. This time, it looked more serious. I opened it, reading each line with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Following numerous complaints from residents regarding inappropriate noise levels emanating from your property, we request that you take the necessary steps to reduce this problem. If the situation does not improve, you may face fines under the Homeowners Association bylaws. I put the letter down and thought for a moment. There was no specific number for inappropriate noise levels, nor any instructions for how to address them. Just a vague warning, but enough to put me on the defensive. I knew exactly what was going on. Linda was more than just a difficult neighbor. She was a full-fledged HOA warrior. With a series of complaints and evidence she had collected, she had forced the HOA to take action. I'm not sure they really believe my farm is a noise crisis, but I do know they hate dealing with people like Linda, residents who constantly email, call, and attend meetings just to complain. And the easiest way for them to deal with it? Send me a warning letter, forcing me to fix the problem so things can calm down. The HOA isn't on anyone's side. They just want peace, even if it means putting pressure on me instead of confronting Linda. But what do they expect me to do? Teach roosters to whisper? Turn goats into ninjas or quiet cows? If I did, I might as well be the master of animal noise control. But I wasn't about to turn my farm into a crazy experiment just because of a controlling neighbor. I couldn't ignore the warning letter. HOAs can impose unreasonable fines, prolong disputes, and even force someone to sell their home. I didn't mean for it to get that far. But what angered me most wasn't the letter, but the feeling of being put on the defensive. I hadn't done anything wrong, but I was being forced to change, while Linda, the initiator of it all, was comfortable playing the victim. If I backed down, she wouldn't stop. Today it was the noise, tomorrow it might be the smell of the chicken coop, the way I stacked the hay, or even the color of the barn. I knew I couldn't sit by and wait for the HOA to turn up the heat. If Linda wanted a confrontation, I couldn't let her win. But to fight back, I needed a plan. A perfect plan that would leave Linda fuming. I don't like confrontation, but if I'm backed into a corner, I'm willing to play by the rules. Or bend them to something more interesting. Linda had gotten the HOA involved, trying to make my little farm into a big deal. She wanted me to shut up, give in, and make things orderly the way she wanted. But I had a rule. If you can't make someone happy, at least give them a good reason to be angry. The morning after the warning letter, I considered my options. I could respond with a letter full of clauses proving that I hadn't broken any rules. I could try to negotiate to keep the peace. But it wasn't about rules or compromise. It was about Linda not wanting me to be here the way I was. She didn't like the farm. She didn't like the animals. She didn't like anything that strayed from her perfect vision of the neighborhood. And if I gave in, she'd find something else to complain about, so why bother trying to please her? Instead of keeping quiet, I decided to amplify the issue. If Linda thought my farm was too noisy, I'd show her what really was. And so, I threw a big BBQ, a perfect weekend of country music, grilled food, laughter, and of course my animal friend. I invited friendly neighbors who weren't affected by Linda's fear-mongering. Not everyone was openly on my side, but many were quietly supportive. And who could resist a free BBQ? I had everything planned. Portable speakers, Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson, and an unprecedentedly loud atmosphere. As the afternoon wore on, the party began. The smell of grilled meat filled the air, and laughter filled the yard. I turned up the volume a little as the upbeat music began, while Buttercup and Daisy shook their new bells, which rang louder than usual. My goats, with their perfect squealing instincts, weren't left out either, and by some coincidence, the chickens decided to chase each other around the yard, creating a cacophony of colorful chaos. I didn't have to wait long for Linda's reaction. As the third song played, she appeared on the other side of the fence, eyes narrowed, arms crossed, looking deeply offended. I could almost see her calculating the details of her next complaint. Loud noise, crowding, disturbing the peace, animal abuse by encouraging them to cry? Who knows? Linda didn't rush over immediately. She stood there watching, perhaps considering whether to call the police. But the thing was, I hadn't done anything wrong. There was no HO rule against BBQs, no one against playing music on Saturday nights, and certainly no law against cows mooing when they were happy. I had made sure I wasn't violating any of the rules, while still putting Linda in a bind. The party lasted late into the night, and when it was over, I looked around with a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just a party, it was a message. I wouldn't be silenced. Linda could complain as much as she wanted, but if she wanted to fight back with ridiculous tactics, I was willing to play along. And I would make sure that every time I counterattacked, she would remember it for the rest of her life. I knew Linda would react, but I didn't expect it to be so quick. As the BBQ was in full swing, I saw her standing on the other side of the fence, her face red with anger, her eyes filled with rage, as if I had just committed some unforgivable crime. Even without the lights, I could see her lips pressed together, her hands shaking as she gripped her phone, as if she were debating whether to storm into my yard or find a more subtle way to express her. I continued to pretend I didn't see her, laughing with the neighbors who were enjoying the relaxed atmosphere I had created. But I knew Linda had already begun to act. She held up her phone, panning the camera across the yard, recording every detail of the riot she believed needed to be documented. She must have recorded every lick of country music, every laugh from the guests, even Buttercup and Daisy bellowing to the music throughout the evening. I also didn't rule out the possibility that she would slow down the chickens running around the yard, amplify the sound of the goat bells, and title the video something like "Neighborhood Noise Crisis, Save Us," to add drama. I don't know what Linda plans to do with the videos, but I can guess the script. She'll send them to the HOA as irrefutable evidence of the out of control of the neighborhood. If that's not enough, she'll post them to the community Facebook group, accompanied by a long, angry post that includes phrases like neighborhood decay, insecurity, and disruptive behavior that must stop. But I doubt even the most jaded neighbors will agree, because all I did was have a legal BBQ in my yard. Linda's anger grew as I ignored her. She probably expected me to panic, to come running and beg her not to file a complaint with the HOA, or at least to look apologetic. But I was still in the middle of the party, laughing, enjoying the barbecue, petting the cows, as if nothing had happened. My calmness seemed to be the last straw for Linda. I saw the change in her body language. The simmering anger turned into an outburst. And then, unable to contain herself any longer, she turned and strode into her house. Minutes later, I realized I was right about something else. Linda hadn't just sent the video to the HOA, she'd decided to go bigger. My phone buzzed with a text from a neighbor. "Linda called the cops, get ready." I laughed. Not because I was taking the situation lightly, but because it was so predictable. If filing a complaint with the HOA wasn't fast enough to shut down my party, the obvious next step would be to call the cops to take care of the disturbance. But Linda had forgotten one important thing. I hadn't done anything wrong. There was no law against hosting a BBQ in a residential area. There was no HOA ordinance limiting the volume of laughter or the volume of cows mooing in excitement. And most of all, there was nothing in Austin city law that allowed the police to intervene in a Saturday night party just because it wasn't to the taste of a cranky neighbor. I continued my party, waiting to see how the police would react to a call from a woman angry that her neighbor's cows were bellowing to the sound of country music. I didn't expect them to show up, but if they did, I would welcome them as honored guests. Perhaps a hot plate of barbecue, or if they preferred, a chance to experience for themselves the crime Linda had reported. I didn't have to wait long to see the consequences of Linda's anger. Just a few days after the BBQ, an official notice from the HOA appeared in my mailbox, summoning me to a special meeting about recent noise complaints. I didn't need to read the entire letter to know who was behind it. Linda had certainly gone all out, not just filing a complaint, but presenting all the evidence. Videos of cows mooing, photos of goats prancing, possibly even recordings of roosters crowing in the morning, all carefully compiled like a legal document. I was prepared for a confrontation, but when I walked into the HOA meeting room that evening, I quickly realized things weren't going the way Linda had expected. Instead of an angry mob, I found residents who came in more curious than tense. Some neighbors smiled and said hello. A few nodded in a friendly manner. Clearly not everyone was caught up in Linda's rage. In fact, most weren't bothered by my farm at all, and if they were, it certainly wasn't as serious as Linda wanted them to believe. The meeting began formally, with an HOA member reading through the general noise rules. I listened calm while Linda sat up straight, eyes shining as if she were about to win. When it came to the formal complaints, the moderator's tone became cautious. The complaints were listed: animal noises, the BBQ, persistent nuisance. But when the moderator asked if anyone felt seriously affected, the room fell silent. Linda looked around, hoping for support, but no one spoke. And then, something Linda didn't expect happened. A neighbor stood up and said his kids loved playing with my goats after school. An older woman said she preferred fresh milk from the farm to grocery store produce. Someone even said the sound of the rooster crowing in the morning sounded more pleasant than the sound of the delivery trucks passing through the neighborhood every day. I glanced at Linda and saw the dismay on her face. She had tried to make me her enemy, but it turned out I was more welcome than she had imagined. But Linda didn't give up easily. She argued vigorously, listing each of my violations, insisting that no one had the right to inconvenience others. But at this point, the HOA began to realize that the real problem wasn't my farm, but Linda's overzealousness. As the argument continued, I realized that I didn't need to say much. My neighbors had spoken for me, and more importantly, the HOA had no reason to impose a fine when no one else agreed with Linda. Finally, after some debate, the HOA made its official decision. There were no violations serious enough to warrant action. Linda may not have been pleased, but there was nothing she could do. The decision had been made, and now, if Linda wanted to continue her appeal, she would have to find another way to deal with the fact that my farm wasn't going anywhere. When the meeting ended, I stood up and said goodbye to everyone before leaving. Linda was still sitting there, her face stony, but I could feel her anger boiling. I didn't need to say anything more. The outcome of the meeting spoke for itself. I had won this battle, and more importantly, I wasn't alone in winning. I had neighbors who weren't easily manipulated by a control freak HOA Karen. After the meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed dramatically, at least for me. I no longer felt pressured to step out into the yard each morning, wondering whether there would be another warning letter in the mailbox. I could enjoy my morning coffee while Buttercup and Daisy grazed, the goats trotted around, and the chickens did their biological duty, crowing to announce the start of the day. Everything returned to normal, except for one thing: Linda. The failure of the HOA meeting must have been a huge blow to Linda. I could imagine that she had spent weeks planning, gathering evidence, even rehearsing her most powerful arguments to expose the noise problem that she believed was ruining the neighborhood. But no one took her side. Instead, everyone took my side, turning Linda from a plaintiff into a real nuisance. When the HOA announced its final decision, I had not violated any rules and there was no legal basis for a fine. I looked at Linda and saw helplessness in her eyes. I don't know what Linda did after the meeting, but this was certainly not the outcome she expected. Perhaps she wrote a long letter to every HOA member, asking them to reconsider the decision, or even tried to contact the city government to suppress my farm in other ways. But no matter what she did, the fact remained the same. She lost. Gradually, Linda stopped blatantly monitoring the farm. No more prying eyes from the windows every morning. No more standing by the fence taking notes like a professional investigator. That didn't mean she'd given up entirely. I still felt her presence in the quick glances she gave me when she passed my house, or the way she avoided me whenever I appeared in the common area. But this time, her silence wasn't acceptance. It was helplessness. Linda had no choice but to accept the reality. My farm was still here, the animals were still making noise every day, and there was nothing she could do about it. If she couldn't stand it, she had no choice but to adapt. I'd heard from a neighbor that Linda had ordered a set of high-end earplugs, the kind designed to block out the noise from airplane engines and construction sites. I couldn't help but laugh at the thought of her sitting in her living room, ears plugged, trying to ignore the fact that she was completely losing the battle. Maybe someday Linda will accept that life in the neighborhood doesn't always go her way. Maybe she'll learn to ignore the roosters crowing, the goat bells, and the country music that blares from my yard every weekend night. Or maybe she'll just keep finding other reasons to cause trouble, because some people just can't live without something to complain about. But either way, I'm not worried about her anymore. I've proven that I'm not easily swayed, that I have the right to live my life my way, as long as I'm not doing anything wrong. And so, every morning I still wake up to the familiar sounds of the farm with a deep sense of satisfaction. The roosters crow, the goats frolic, Buttercup and Daisy bleat contentedly. I take a deep breath, smiling at the inevitable fact. Linda may hate all those sounds, but it's not me who has to adapt, it's her. After the HOA cleared me of violations, farm life quickly returned to normal. But even though there were no more complaints, I knew Linda hadn't really given up. Every time she passed my house, she still gave me a look of annoyance, as if she could find a good reason to start a new campaign of complaints. I didn't like to cause trouble, but I also didn't give up. If Linda had spent months trying to silence my farm, I was going to make sure it was even more alive than before. So I decided to make the perfect move, add a new rooster to the flock. Not just any rooster, but a real warrior, one that crowed the loudest in the area. I went to a nearby farm and picked out the perfect candidate, a tall, bright red rooster with a loud crowing voice that seemed destined to be the alarm clock for the entire neighborhood. The farmer laughed and said that it could crow at any time of the day, not just in the morning. I just nodded in satisfaction, knowing that I had brought home the ultimate weapon. In the first few days after I brought it home, I didn't need to say anything because Linda would definitely notice. And sure enough, after only a few mornings, I saw her silhouette at the window, her eyes filled with rage as the rooster's duet crowed louder than ever. She probably tried everything to block out the sound, plugging her ears, closing her windows, maybe even finding some kind of soundproofing technology. But the truth was, there was nothing she could do. Gradually, Linda appeared less and less, no longer watching my every move or trying to drag the neighbors into pointless fights. Maybe she had accepted defeat, or was just waiting for an opportunity to strike back. But either way, I didn't care. I won, not only in my confrontation with Linda, but also in asserting my right to live my life the way I wanted, as long as I did nothing wrong. Linda might hate the sound, but she had no choice. Either live with it or find another place with no farms, no animals, and especially no one like me. Every morning, when the two roosters crowed together to announce the new day, I just sipped my coffee, smiled at the rising sun, and enjoyed the moment. The fight with Linda is over, but the lesson remains. I stood up for my right to live my life the way I want, and to prove that no one can dictate to anyone else. She may not be happy, but I still keep the farm and live the way I want. This story makes you wonder, have you ever encountered a flower Karen? Do you stand up for your right to live when you are being controlled? Share your story in the comments, and don't let anyone dictate how you live.